Et ensuite, on va écouter donc Lorenzo, que l'on connaît, puisqu'il est déjà intervenu, sur les préventions et les réponses.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think if you had a tough job, mine is even tougher. So tough act to follow, last act before Florence closure, but anyway, drinks and whatever happens. And and everything has been said. Having said so, let me still address a few things. I mean, as a closing speech, I think Florence sort of said, well, let's talk about preventions and things that can be done. And I think we start probably by, and we all have talked about it in different ways, what has made Islamists so successful? Although I always say, let's try not to think them as almighty and all-powerful and infallible. They make a lot of mistakes. And so there's a combination of factors, of elements that we've all touched upon during the day. I would say 5 main elements that have made Islamists so successful. Funding, just brought up, access to massive funding resources. The second is the ability to create very clever, flexible political alliances. The third is exploiting the widespread ignorance about Islam and Islamism that exists in our societies. The fourth, I would say, is their ability to exploit the law. And the fifth would be the ability to exploit our cultural trends. So these are and I'm simplifying things a bit, obviously. These are the main elements that have allowed Islamists to thrive. Tackling, challenging all 5 elements seems to be the direction to the solution. It's obviously way more complicated than that, and I always take, Sir John's personal experience as to the difficulty of having government, even under the leadership of somebody like Cameron, that understood the challenge, but to get massive machineries to function. So let's go one by one. What has been done? What can be done? How can one somewhat fix these things? We said funding, access to massive funding. If you remember in the morning, I talked about different streams of funding. Now, there's been measures being taken in different European countries to try to stem the flow of money that helps Islamists. The Austrian government has passed legislation that bans entirely foreign funding, only to Muslim organizations. It's something that the Austrian can do because of peculiarities in their constitution. It would not fly in most other countries. France, under the separatism law, has introduced, as far as I can tell, more stringent transparency measures that force some of these entities to disclose more about their sources of funding. And I think what we have seen, and again, it's anecdotal, bits and pieces there, is that whenever financial investigations are opened, and I take what Magnus said earlier, without coming up with new laws, without coming up with something that singles out Muslim organizations, but simply applying the laws on the book and putting resources to it, because you can write the best law on the planet, but if you don't have manpower to enforce this, it's pointless. But we have seen investigations that reveal a lot and reveal well beyond the potential fiscal, money, bureaucratic inefficiencies of these organizations. Canadian government has opened a very interesting tax audit. It sounds very boring, Canadian government tax audit, something extremely dull. But it is actually a quite fascinating investigation into the largest sort of Muslim Brotherhood adjacent organization in Canada. And as a tax authority, they can audit. And they can audit, they get emails, they get all kind of the internal communiques. And as you can imagine, aside of the different irregularities and tax issues that you might imagine they picked up, they also found a lot of information that helps us understand how these organizations function, not just in Canada. For example, the fact that this organization was receiving, I would say, marching orders from Cairo. I think we've always said that I've always said it, I've been 20 years writing about it, saying, well, they're independent. I said it this morning. Well, yes and no. Here you get a flow of emails coming from Cairo, from top leadership of the Brotherhood, telling them how to do things. So getting into these investigations is a good way to challenge these entities, but also to uncover more about them. As a good dual citizen of the United States and Italy, I'm reminded of the Al Capone example as the guy who was never taken down because of all the people he killed, but simply because he didn't pay his taxes. So you don't mess with the tax authority in the US, But I would say it would be good to have the same dynamic applied to other countries, just enforce the laws on the book. I said earlier that there are 4 main streams of funding. I said zakat, it's foreign funding, and I think when it comes to foreign funding, you might not be able to ban, but I think certain governments might have the ability to put diplomatic pressure on some of the countries that do fund from outside and tell them to stop some of that. Might not always work out, but I think we still have leverage. The one thing, the one source of funding which we should be able to stop, and there should be no compromise on that, is the public funding that goes to these organizations. The local level, state level, EU funding that goes to these organizations that legitimizes, that needs to stop. As most things, though, easier said than done. How do you actually stop that? I know it's been a big conversation in France. You can make a list and say money doesn't go to organization A, B, C, and D. Guess what? Next month, the organizations are going to be called E, F, G, and H, and they're going to apply under new names. So it's the cat and mouse game. So one needs to be smart about that. Now, the second point I said is political alliances. The ability of these organizations to create these friendships, these tactical cooperations with actors that range. I mean, we talked a lot about progressive allies, but if I look at the American experience, historically, it's actually been more with the conservatives, been very close alliances with evangelicals. Until October 6th of last year, the close alliance was actually between Islamists and the more conservative parts of the Republican Party based on their opposition to gender ideology. So flexibility in alliances is there. And I think one way to do that is to name and shame, to hold the allies, the fellow travelers of these organizations to their declared standards. In a UK setting, I remember in a post 7/7, after the attacks of July 2005, when the British government was leaning on all these imams to try to have cooperation. I think they had the genius idea of calling Tariq Ramadan to the UK as the guy who ran that. I mean, probably a favor to France. I mean, it took Tariq Ramadan out of the picture, in France at least. And what some media did was to show that these imams, which are almost inevitably all of them Islamists, that were taking pictures with ministers, with politicians, and saying all the nice things you would expect them, a week earlier or the day after said the worst things, said that the attacks were carried out by the Mossad, that it was an inside operation by MI5, that Jews carried it out, all the stuff that you can imagine. And that is very embarrassing to politicians. That is very embarrassing to whoever has these alliances. And, if politicians do respond to these sort of accusations of Islamophobia, they're paralyzing. I think they also respond to the naming and shaming and showing that they have exercised poor judgment in teaming up with certain partners. I think when it comes to that, though, the important thing is to have this sort of exposés in a very mainstream way. And obviously there's a lot of this information out there. The concern I often have is that it's relegated to some dark corners of the internet. In some cases, when for whatever reason it gets to the mainstream, it has a devastating impact. We talked a lot about Islamic Relief today. That's a wonderful case study of that, in which when the London Times decided to publish twice in a row front page stories exposing how Islamic Relief, 3 of the 5 trustees of Islamic Relief had a pattern of extremely anti-Semitic posting on Facebook, the whole world came crumbling down for Islamic Relief. The whole board of trustees had to be basically resigned, and they stopped receiving donations from the US government, the Dutch government, the German government, to the tune of the 10 of million of euros in losses. So naming and shaming, and I think it's a way to undermine these political alliances and this legitimacy they're trying to build. Ignorance, the third element, the ability to exploit the general lack of understanding of the diversity of the Muslim community, of the difference between Islam and Islamism. And yeah, I mean, it's puzzling that almost 25 years after 9/11, there's still a lot of people who in very important places in governments that don't know the most basic things about this. A lot of efforts have been done. I mean, one of the things that Sir John did as a recommendation of the review in the UK was to build a unit within government, the Extremism Analysis Unit, whose job is to be a permanent clearinghouse, collecting all information, and with people coming from different parts of government, from the security services to the Department of Education, because obviously this is something that works on many levels, and the idea is then to disseminate that knowledge. Did it work? Not so much. The Austrians have done something that I think it's. I'm on the academic board, so I'm a bit biased. I'm going to say good things about him, which is called basically the Observatory on Political Islam, Dokumentationsstelle on Political Islam, which does the same thing. It publishes. This is more of a public body. It's funded by the Austrian government, but it's a public body that produces research on the topic, and it informs the public. It's challenging though, and here I'm going to be bit of negative for a second. It's a small field. It's delightful to be always at these conferences. It's always the same people at these conferences, and it's lots of friends. It's great. We all see each other. I love it. And tonight we'll go out with drinks. It's lovely on a personal level. I take a step back. Strategically, it's devastating, because it means that it's a very small pool out there of people who want to do that. And we go back to the question that was asked earlier about, more people doing this and how this is a bit of a career suicide for young people. And I think that should change. And I've been very nice to friends before. I'm going to have a constructive criticism of France now and say that this should be something which France should take the leadership of. Because France is the country that probably understands the challenge more than others, but has an established political leadership that understands it. It's not perfect. I mean, I'm sure you can see a million things that are not okay here, but comparatively speaking, France, I speak as a system, understands the challenge, probably because there's a bigger challenge than others. And it's, again, painful as an Italian to say, but it's France. It should lead Europe. And on this field, I don't really see it. There should be a French leadership in creating centers of understanding, of research of this, not just in France, but at the European level, using something like RAN, for example, to create a broad understanding of this. And I don't really see that happening. The fourth point, I said the Islamist ability to understand our legal systems and exploit the crevices. We should do the same. We should use our legal system to our advantage, and it's what Magnus was saying. Again, without doing anything new, without necessarily, some tweaks could be done, but without turning upside down any sacrosanct constitutional right, any civil liberty, but just applying the laws that exist, because certain behaviors that are tolerated when it comes to Islamist milieus would never be tolerated if they came from other milieus. And this is, so the anti-Semitism, the misogyny, the different problematic views. You can see that, I think Heini was talking about social media, and the unfair approach. We see it in our research all the time. If you say something that is, basically, we're doing a study right now that is anti-Semitic, but coming from the extreme right, it is taken down fairly quickly. But if it comes from an Islamist milieu, it is taken down with less speed, let's put it like that. And that is just wrong. It's an unequal application of the law, and it's what some people would call, at the end of the day, the racism of low expectations. You're applying a different standards to a certain group. Everybody should be held to the same standards. There's no reason why the extremes in one group should be treated differently from the others. In a way, that is the real discriminatory approach. Now, of course, challenging when it comes to the law. We go back to what Liliana was saying. Legalist organization works within the law. There are some activities, of course, that are illegal. You can argue that it's feindlich, that it's the goal in the end, it's subversive. Nonetheless, it is very, very challenging to come up, it's easy to give a speech and say we should do this and big picture kind of thing, but when you get to the tactical level, the nitty-gritty, it's very, very complicated. We talk a lot about organizations and shutting them down and close this, close that. What happens the next day? It's the same thing as I said about applying for grants at the EU. It's great, for example, that the French government has shut down many organizations and they pop up the next day. On some level, they actually have the victimhood mantle on, and I think the same applies to Hizb ut-Tahrir in Germany. It's the same thing. So it's about people, not about organizations. And so I think, again, within the limits of the laws and without any violation of constitutional rights, it's more about targeting individuals, the key players, rather than targeting organizations. We target organizations as well, fine, but I think we're talking about a small group of charismatic individuals. The organizations are sort of something that can be recreated easily. I'm going to be patriotic Italian for a second. Italy has a very strict enforcement of immigration laws. Italy expels, on average, around 150 people for extremism every year. That's basically 1 every 2 days. Those numbers are completely unparalleled in any European country, and it's not just jihadists, it's at times just people who have views that are highly problematic. Because if you're in the country, if you're not a citizen and you expose those views, that means you don't ascribe to the constitutional values of Italy. And so there's a law passed in 2005 that says that you don't belong in the country, and the deportation is done very quickly through an administrative decree that can be appealed after it's executed. So it makes it quite effective. The fifth point is the Islamist exploitation of our cultural trends, and this is obviously the most complicated part. The first 4 points are somewhat tactical. We're talking about funding. We're talking about the big picture stuff we've been discussing. The fact that we have sort of an unwillingness at times to just stand up for what are basic constitutional values of our countries. How the accusation of Islamophobia is paralyzing, and here it's difficult to come up with an easy solution. I think I take sort of Magnus' approach, which is just grow a spine. I mean, just in a way, and to some degree, I find it puzzling at times how, particularly at the political level, the accusation of Islamophobia is so paralyzing. I get it, of course, but politicians live with the obsession of polls. And when it comes to polling, I think it's pretty clear where, in every European country, with some differences, where the majority of people stand. And I think some of the most successful politicians of the centrist politicians of the last few years are people like, I know in France I shouldn't be saying pro-Macron things, I should be more neutral, but people like Macron or Kurz, who have been able to intercept a malaise that is very common throughout society, but is not just limited to the right, and understanding that intercepting that malaise is not just something that is good for France, good for Austria, but very cynically good for them. Because if they don't do it, the extreme right will. And so they have been able to understand that this is something, of course, does it get them into a lot of trouble with parts of the media? Does it get them into being accused of Islamophobia and so on? Yes, but that's the life of a politician. You take it. That's how it is. And I think to some degree that should apply also to people who are at lower levels of that. I think obviously.
Left. Okay.
Oh, Mom. Sorry. Okay, no, makes sense. I do take. I'm just going to echo a couple of one point that I think, although I think he left, Imam Shaghlumi said about, and we're discussing at lunch about what is sometimes, try to be positive here because otherwise it's always negative. And on some level, I find the change of the discourse in the Middle East over the last 10 years relatively inspiring and a source of optimism. Now, I'm very mindful as to why several governments, several regimes in the Middle East take a very hard stand on the Brotherhood. It's obviously largely for self-serving reasons. I'm not naive. Nonetheless, the change in the Middle East has happened largely, and setbacks are always possible, not just in governments when it comes to Islamism, but also the popular level. And I think it's fair to say that the Brotherhood in the Middle East, it's arguably at its lowest point of sympathy in its almost 100-year history. It is quite paradoxical, and it either drives crazy or makes people in the Middle East laugh as to the opposite is happening in the West, where actually Islamists seem to be quite on the rise. So maybe this is the one time things change here. So anyways, thank you very much. I don't want to overdo my time, and thank you.
Merci.